Sometimes, when life breaks you, you need to build something no one else understands. Reid Mallow knew that feeling well. At 52, he'd lost his marriage, his daughter, and any reason to stay. So he disappeared into the Montana wilderness with a chainsaw and a plan to start over. He built a cabin by hand, log by log. But then he added something strange, a second roof hovering above the first, like one shelter protecting another. His family laughed when they saw photos. They thought he'd lost his mind. Reid never explained himself. He never mentioned the old drawings or the snow that wouldn't fall beneath that upper roof. What was he really protecting? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Reid Mallow first saw the land on a Tuesday in March, though "saw" was generous. The real estate listing had 3 grainy photos and a GPS coordinate. 23 acres of forest and rock in northwestern Montana, 47 miles from the nearest town with a post office. No road access, no utilities, no neighbors within a 10-mile radius. The price was suspiciously low, even for raw land this remote. He bought it sight unseen with what remained in his savings account after the divorce settlement. That was 6 months ago, 6 months since the judge had awarded primary custody to Jennifer, his ex-wife, citing Reid's emotional instability and inability to provide a stable home environment. 6 months since he'd watched 15-year-old Maya refuse to look at him as she left the courtroom. 6 months since he'd walked out of the Boston architectural firm where he'd spent 23 years designing buildings he no longer cared about. The cabin he built stood in a clearing he'd carved from dense pine forest. It measured 20 feet by 24 feet, small but meticulously planned. The logs were hand-hewn Douglas fir, each one stripped and notched with the kind of precision that came from decades of understanding how materials wanted to fit together. The chinking was a mixture of clay, sand, and lime he'd mixed himself. The windows were salvaged from a demolition site in Kalispell, their old glass wavy but intact. Reid had arrived in late April with a 4-wheel drive truck he'd bought for cash, loaded with tools, a tent, and enough canned food to last 2 months. The access road, such as it was, ended 3 miles from his property line. He'd spent the first week clearing a rough track through the forest, working from dawn until his hands cramped around the chainsaw handle. At night, he'd collapsed in the tent, too exhausted to dream. That kind of exhaustion was exactly what he'd been looking for. The foundation had taken 3 weeks. He dug down past the frost line, set forms, mixed concrete in a portable mixer powered by a small generator. Every calculation, every measurement, every level check. It was the first time in years he'd felt his mind clear. Architecture had always been his refuge, the place where chaos resolved into clean lines and logical solutions. But somewhere in the last decade of committee meetings and client revisions and budget compromises, he'd lost that clarity. Out here, there were no compromises. The laws were simpler: gravity, weather, structural integrity. Either the building stood or it fell. He'd raised the walls log by log through May and into June. The work was brutal. His back ached constantly. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses, then blisters that burst and hardened into new skin. He lost 20 pounds he couldn't afford to lose, but every evening when he stepped back and saw what he'd built with his own hands, something in his chest that had been clenched tight for years loosened just slightly. The roof should have been straightforward. A simple gable design, metal sheeting over plywood sheathing, properly ventilated. He'd drawn up the plans, calculated the load, ordered the materials. Then he found the journal. It was buried 18 inches down, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly disintegrated. He'd been digging a root cellar on the north side of the cabin when his shovel hit something that wasn't rock. The journal itself was leather-bound, the pages brittle and water-stained but still legible. The handwriting was careful, almost obsessive in its precision. The first entry was dated July 15, 1887. Arrived at the site marked on Crowfeather's map. The land feels wrong, not dangerous precisely, but displaced, as though the air itself is thinner here, less substantial. My instruments give inconsistent readings. The compass spins. I should abandon this survey and report the land unsuitable for development. The surveyor's name was written on the inside cover, Nathaniel Hollis, U.S. Geological Survey. Reid had read the entire journal that night by lantern light, turning the fragile pages with dirty fingers. Hollis had stayed despite his misgivings. He'd documented strange phenomena. Animals that wouldn't cross certain lines on the property. Zones where snow melted in patterns that defied meteorology. Sounds in the night that had no source. And he documented the structure the indigenous people in the area had once maintained on this exact spot. A shelter with 2 roofs, one suspended above the other. The journal included sketches. Hollis had been a competent draftsman. The drawings showed the double roof design in detail, a lower roof that protected the dwelling itself, and an upper roof, larger and slightly offset, that hovered approximately 8 feet above it. The upper roof was supported by posts that stood free of the cabin walls, creating an open space between the 2 layers. Hollis's notes beside the sketches were cryptic. The old man says the upper roof catches what falls from above. Not rain, not snow, something else that seeks warmth and life. The lower roof hides the home beneath. False ceiling for false eyes. Reid had reread that passage a dozen times, trying to pass whether Hollis had been recording genuine indigenous knowledge or descending into paranoia. The later journal entries suggested the latter. Hollis wrote about hearing whispers, about seeing movement in his peripheral vision, about the growing conviction that he was being watched by something that existed just slightly out of phase with normal reality. The final entry was dated October 3, 1887. I am leaving this journal as a record and a warning. This land should not be developed. It should not be inhabited. The boundaries between here and elsewhere are too thin. I have done what I can to mark the safe zones. Anyone who finds this, build the double roof or build nothing at all. Reid should have dismissed it as the ravings of a man who'd spent too long alone in the wilderness. He should have built his simple gable roof and gotten on with his life of productive isolation. Instead, he'd modified his plans. The upper roof had taken all of July and half of August to build. It required engineering that made no practical sense. Support posts sunk 8 feet to the ground, reinforced with concrete. A frame structure designed to hold twice the necessary load. A roof that extended 15 feet beyond the cabin's footprint in all directions, creating a canopy that shadowed nearly half an acre. His brother Thomas had called in early August, the first contact they'd had since Reid left Boston. "I saw the photos you sent Mom," Thomas said, his voice tight with concern masquerading as irritation. "What the hell are you building out there? It looks like you put a garage roof over a shed." "It's an experiment," Reid had said. "Architectural concept I'm testing." "It looks insane. You look insane. Mom's worried sick. Sarah wants to know if we should be having you evaluated." Reid had ended the call without answering. Sarah was his younger sister, a clinical psychologist, and the last person he wanted evaluating anything about his current mental state. But their concern wasn't entirely unwarranted. He knew how it looked. The upper roof was strange, awkward, technically unnecessary, and he couldn't explain why he'd built it because he didn't fully understand himself. Only that reading Hollis's journal had triggered something in him, a certainty that felt less like belief and more like memory. He'd finished the cabin in September. The interior was sparse. A wood stove he'd installed himself, a sleeping loft, a small kitchen area with a propane camp stove and a basin for washing. He'd built furniture from leftover lumber, a table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf. He had solar panels on the lower roof providing enough electricity for lights and to charge his laptop. A well he'd drilled gave him clean water. It wasn't comfort, but it was sufficient. The first snow had come in late September, a light dusting that melted by noon. Reid had been splitting firewood when he noticed it. The snow had fallen everywhere except in a perfect circle beneath the upper roof. Not melted. Simply absent, as though that patch of ground existed under different weather. He'd stood staring at the clear ground for 20 minutes, axe forgotten in his hands, trying to find a rational explanation. Wind patterns, maybe. Heat rising from the cabin below creating a microclimate. Temperature differentials in the soil. None of it made sense. That night, he'd heard sounds outside. Not animal sounds, though the forest was full of those. These were different. Soft, almost like whispers, like voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. He'd lain in his sleeping loft, staring at the ceiling, listening to his heart pound against his ribs. In the morning, he'd found tracks in the snow. They led up to the edge of the protected circle and stopped. Not turned away, simply stopped, as though whatever had made them had encountered an invisible wall. The tracks didn't match any animal Reid knew. They were roughly the size of a large dog's paw, but the pattern was wrong. The spacing odd. He'd photographed them with his phone, though he knew he'd never show the pictures to anyone. Who would he tell? His family already thought he was losing his grip on reality. The few people he'd encountered in the nearest town, Ironwood, population 347, treated him with a polite wariness reserved for hermits and eccentrics. And maybe they were right. Maybe he was losing himself out here in the silence and the snow. Maybe the isolation was doing something to his perception, making him see patterns that didn't exist, hear threats in the wind. But every night the sounds came, and every morning the tracks appeared at the boundary of the protected space and went no farther. Reid had stopped trying to explain it. He'd simply accepted it the way he accepted the cold and the dark. As a condition of this place, this land he'd claimed without understanding what he was claiming. October passed. November arrived with serious snowfall. Reid had settled into a routine: rise at dawn, maintain the cabin and the roof structure, chop wood, read by lantern light, sleep. He spoke to no one. His phone had minimal signal, and he rarely charged it. When his mother called, he let it go to voicemail. When Thomas left increasingly worried messages, he deleted them without listening all the way through. He was alone. That was the point. That was what he'd come here to be. The divorce had gutted him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not the loss of Jennifer. Their marriage had been dying for years, a slow fade from passion to cohabitation to resentful silence. But losing Maya had broken something fundamental. She'd been his daughter, his constant, the one part of his life that had felt unambiguously good. And he'd failed her. He'd withdrawn into work during her childhood, prioritized projects over recitals, let Jennifer handle the emotional labor of parenting while he handled the bills. By the time Maya hit adolescence and started pulling away, he hadn't known how to bridge the gap he'd created. Every attempt at connection felt forced, awkward. She'd looked at him with increasing contempt, as though she could see exactly how inadequate he was. The final blow had come during the custody hearing when Maya's therapist testified that Reid had emotionally absented himself from the family unit and that Maya expressed no desire for extended contact with her father. He'd sat in the courtroom listening to his failures catalogued in clinical language, and he'd had no defense because it was all true. So he'd left, packed up what fit in his truck, drove west, and kept driving until he ran out of road. Now he lived under a double roof in the Montana wilderness, protected from things he couldn't name by architecture he didn't fully understand, more alone than he'd ever been. But at least out here, his failures were his own. At least out here, there was no one left to disappoint. December came with temperatures that dropped below zero. Reid had enough firewood stacked to last the winter. His food supplies were adequate. He had books, his journal, his own thoughts for company. He'd convinced himself he could live this way indefinitely, a hermit architect maintaining his strange shelter in the mountains, slowly fading from the memory of everyone who'd once known him. Then, on a Thursday morning 2 weeks before Christmas, he'd walked the 3 miles to where he'd left his truck and found an envelope zip-tied to the steering wheel. The return address was a law firm in Boston. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a custody modification order. Jennifer was sending Maya to spend the winter with him. She'd be arriving in 3 days. Reid read the letter 3 times, standing in the snow beside his truck, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The language was formal, legally precise. Jennifer had petitioned for a temporary custody modification based on behavioral concerns and therapeutic recommendations. Maya had been suspended from school twice in the past month, once for fighting, once for what the letter delicately termed disruptive conduct. Her therapist suggested a change of environment might provide perspective and reset. In other words, Jennifer couldn't handle her anymore and was dumping the problem on Reid. The irony would have been funny if his hands weren't shaking. 3 days. Maya would arrive in 3 days, and he had no idea how to prepare for that. The cabin barely had room for 1 person, let alone 2. There was no privacy, no separation between the sleeping loft and the main living space. No bathroom, just an outhouse he'd built 50 yards into the woods. No shower. He heated water on the stove and washed from a basin. He'd been living like a 19th century homesteader, and that had been fine for him. But for a 15-year-old girl accustomed to suburban comfort, it was going to be a disaster. Reid drove into Ironwood in a state of mounting panic. The town consisted of a single main street, a gas station, a general store, a diner, a post office, and a bar. He parked outside the general store and went in with a list he'd scribbled on the back of the custody letter. Warm clothes for a teenage girl, toiletries, food that wasn't canned beans and instant coffee, a sleeping bag, a better lantern, books maybe, though he had no idea what 15-year-olds read anymore. The woman behind the counter, Denise, according to her name tag, watched him with undisguised curiosity as he loaded items into a shopping cart. "Expecting company?" she asked. "My daughter's visiting." The words felt strange in his mouth. My daughter. As though he had any right to claim that relationship. "That's nice. How old?" 15. Denise's expression shifted to something like sympathy. "Teenage girls are tough. Got 3 of my own. They'll eat you out of house and home and tell you they hate you, but deep down they're just scared of everything." Reid nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He paid for everything with cash. Nearly $300, a significant dent in his dwindling reserves. He loaded the supplies into the truck bed and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, trying to steady himself. The last time he'd seen Maya had been at the custody hearing 7 months ago. She'd worn all black, her hair dyed a dark purple he knew Jennifer hated. She'd sat beside her mother with her arms crossed, her face a mask of teenage contempt. When the judge had asked if she wanted to speak, she'd said only, "I don't want to see him. He was never really there anyway." Those words had lived in Reid's chest like a stone ever since. Now she was coming here, to this remote cabin, to spend the winter with the father she'd rejected. Not by choice. That much was clear. Jennifer was forcing this, probably as some kind of last resort, or maybe as punishment for both of them. Reid drove back to the property as the afternoon light began to fail. He unloaded the supplies, then spent the next 2 days in a frenzy of preparation. He built a second sleeping loft on the opposite side of the cabin, giving Maya some semblance of privacy. He cleaned obsessively, scrubbing the floor planks, washing the few dishes he owned, organizing his books into neat stacks. He installed curtains made from canvas drop cloths to divide the sleeping areas. He chopped extra firewood until his shoulders burned. He rehearsed conversations in his head. "Maya, I know this isn't what you wanted. Maya, I'm sorry for not being there. Maya, I hope we can start over. Everything sounded hollow, inadequate. On the third day, he hiked the 3 miles to his truck at dawn and drove to the small regional airport 2 hours away. Maya's flight was scheduled to arrive at 2:00 p.m. He waited in the parking lot, watching planes land, his stomach in knots. When she finally emerged from the terminal, pulling a battered suitcase, he almost didn't recognize her. She'd cut her hair short, shaved on one side. She wore ripped jeans, combat boots, an oversized flannel jacket covered in band patches. She looked older than 15 and angrier than he remembered. Their eyes met across the parking lot. Maya's expression didn't change. She walked toward the truck with the mechanical movement of someone fulfilling an obligation. "Hi," Reid said. "Hey." Her voice was flat, affectless. "How was the flight?" "Fine." He took her suitcase, loaded it into the truck bed. They drove in silence. Reid tried several times to start a conversation, asked about school, about her friends, about music, but Maya's responses were monosyllabic. Eventually he gave up and focused on driving. The landscape changed as they headed into the mountains. Suburban sprawl gave way to forest, paved roads to gravel. Maya stared out the window, her expression unreadable. When they reached the end of the access road and Reid parked the truck, she looked at him with something close to alarm. "We have to walk from here," he said. "It's about 3 miles. "You're kidding." "The terrain's too rough for vehicles. I've got a trail cleared." Maya closed her eyes, took a breath. "Of course you do." They walked in silence, Reid carrying her suitcase, Maya following with her backpack. The trail was well maintained. He'd spent weeks on it, but it was still a hike through dense forest. Maya struggled in her combat boots, which clearly weren't designed for wilderness walking. She didn't complain, but he could see her discomfort. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting. The upper roof cast long shadows across the clearing. Maya stopped, staring up at the structure. "What the hell is that?" "It's the roof," Reid said. "There are 2 of them." "Yes." "Why?" Reid had prepared for this question, but now that it was asked, his prepared answer, architectural experiment, structural testing, weather protection, felt like lies. He settled for, "It's complicated. I'll explain inside." Maya continued staring at the double roof for a long moment, her expression shifting from confusion to something harder to read. Finally, she followed him into the cabin. The interior was warm, at least. Reid had kept the stove going all day. Maya looked around at the sparse space, the rough furniture, the lanterns, the complete absence of anything resembling modern comfort, and he watched her face close down completely. "There's no electricity," she said. It wasn't a question. "Solar panels provide some, enough for lights and charging phones." "Is there Wi-Fi?" "No." "Running water?" "There's a well, and I heat water for washing." Maya was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where's the bathroom?" Reid pointed toward the door. "Outhouse, about 50 yards that way." She looked at him like he'd just told her they'd be eating dirt for dinner. "An outhouse. I know it's not ideal." "Not ideal?" Her voice rose for the first time, breaking through the flat effect. "This is insane. You're living like some kind of pioneer weirdo in the middle of nowhere with that freaky double roof thing, and Mom just dumped me here like I'm being sent to wilderness therapy." Reid absorbed this, trying to find words that wouldn't make it worse. "I know this is hard. I know you didn't choose to be here, but we'll figure it out. I've set up a sleeping space for you, and I don't want to figure it out. I want to go home." "Maya." "Don't." She held up a hand. "Just show me where I'm sleeping." Reid pointed to the new loft. Maya climbed the ladder without another word, pulled the canvas curtain closed, and didn't emerge for the rest of the night. Reid sat by the stove, listening to the sounds of his daughter crying quietly above him, and felt the weight of every failure that had led them both to this moment. Outside, in the darkness beyond the upper roof's protection, something moved through the trees. The whispers had returned, as they did every night. But for the first time since building the shelter, Reid wasn't thinking about the strange sounds, or the tracks in the snow, or the things Nathaniel Hollis had written about in his deteriorating journal. He was thinking about how to survive the winter with a daughter who hated him, in a cabin that barely held 2 people, beneath a roof that protected them from threats she didn't yet know existed. Morning came cold and bright. Reid woke to find Maya already awake, sitting at the table with her sketchbook open, drawing in quick, angry strokes. She didn't acknowledge him when he climbed down from his loft. He made coffee, real coffee, one of the luxuries he'd bought in town, and scrambled eggs on the camp stove. Maya accepted the plate he offered without speaking, ate mechanically while continuing to draw. Reid tried not to look at what she was sketching, but it was impossible not to notice. The double roof, rendered in aggressive pencil lines that seemed to attack the page. She'd captured it perfectly. The strange hovering quality, the way it didn't quite make sense to the eye. "You're good," he said. "At drawing." Maya's pencil paused for half a second, then continued. "Mom says it's a waste of time. Says I should focus on subjects that matter. Your mother's wrong about that." This earned him a glance, quick, suspicious, searching for the trap. When she didn't find one, she returned to her sketch. "You would say that. You're an architect. You draw buildings." "True," Reid corrected. "Past tense. And I was never as good as you are." It wasn't flattery. The sketch showed genuine talent, an intuitive grasp of perspective and proportion that most people never developed. Maya had inherited that from him. The spatial reasoning, the ability to see how things fit together in 3 dimensions. It was one of the few gifts he'd actually given her. They ate in silence for a while. Then Maya said, without looking up, "So are you going to explain the roof thing, or are we just pretending it's normal?" Reid set down his coffee cup. He'd known this conversation was coming, but he still wasn't ready for it. How did you explain something you didn't fully understand yourself? "It's based on an old design," he started. "Indigenous peoples in this area used to build structures with double roofs. The upper layer provides protection from—" He paused. "From what? Things that move through the night? Entities that exist slightly out of phase with reality?" "From severe weather," he finished lamely. Maya looked at him, her expression flat. "That's the biggest load of crap I've ever heard." Reid felt his face heat. "It's complicated. Everything with you is complicated. That's your excuse for everything." She closed her sketchbook with more force than necessary. "Fine, don't explain. I'm stuck here anyway, so what does it matter?" She stood, grabbed her jacket, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Reid asked. "Out. To explore this wonderful nature experience you've trapped me in." She left before he could respond, the door banging shut behind her. Reid watched through the window as Maya walked to the edge of the clearing, then stood looking up at the upper roof. Even from inside, he could see her analyzing it, trying to puzzle out its purpose. She walked the perimeter, examining the support posts, the way the larger roof extended well beyond the cabin's footprint. He should go after her, should try to explain properly. But what would he say? That he'd found a 100-year-old journal written by a surveyor who might have been insane? That he'd built the roof based on paranoid ravings and sketches that might mean nothing? That every night he heard things moving in the darkness, and every morning found tracks that stopped at an invisible boundary? She'd think he'd lost his mind. She might be right. Maya spent most of the day outside, wandering the property with her sketchbook. Reid watched from the windows, giving her space but tracking her location. He told himself it was for safety. She didn't know the terrain, could get lost easily. But really, he just wanted to know where she was, this angry daughter who'd been returned to him like a problem to solve. When she came back at dusk, her cheeks were red from cold and she was shivering. Reid had heated water for washing and set it out with a towel. Maya looked at the setup, a basin on a small table, steam rising in the lamplight, and something in her face softened slightly. "Thanks," she said quietly. They made dinner together, though together was generous. Reid cooked while Maya sat at the table, drawing. But she was there, in the same space, and that felt like progress. "What are you working on?" Reid asked. Maya held up the sketchbook. She'd done a dozen studies of the double roof from different angles, each one more detailed than the last. In the margins, she'd written notes. Support beam spacing, 8 FIT intervals. Upper roof extends 15 FT past lower roof perimeter. Why? No visible attachment points between layers. Reid stared at the annotations. "You measured it?" "Paced it out. I'm good at estimating distances." She looked at him. "I got that from you, probably. The spatial thing." It was the first acknowledgement she'd made of their connection, of anything she might have inherited from him. Reid felt something catch in his throat. "The building gene," he said. "Your grandfather had it too. He was a carpenter. He could look at a space and know exactly what would fit, what wouldn't. Never needed to measure twice." Maya considered this. "I never met him. He died when I was in college, but he taught me everything about how things go together, how materials want to behave." Reid paused. "I should have taught you. Should have shown you how to build things, how to see structures the way we do. You were always working." "I know." They were quiet for a moment. Then Maya said, "The roof design is actually kind of brilliant. Stupid, but brilliant. Like, it makes no practical sense, but the engineering is solid. The weight distribution is perfect. It shouldn't work, but it does." Reid felt an absurd swell of pride. She'd understood it, at least technically. That's exactly it. It's irrational architecture that functions anyway. But why build it? What's it actually for? Reid could feel the moment stretching, the opportunity to tell her the truth or to keep lying. He settled for something in between. Protection. From what? "I'm not entirely sure yet." Maya studied him, and he could see her intelligent mind working through possibilities. "You found something, didn't you? When you were building, something that made you change the plans." She was too perceptive, always had been. "Yes. Are you going to tell me what?" "Not yet. Not until I understand it better myself." Maya looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she just nodded. "Okay. But when you figure it out, you tell me. No more complicated excuses. Deal?" That night, after Maya had gone up to her loft, Reid lay awake listening. The whispers came as always, soft and insistent. But this time, he thought he heard something else beneath them. Footsteps circling the cabin, testing the boundary. He got up quietly and looked out the window. The moon was bright enough to see by. Beyond the shadow of the upper roof, the snow was pristine white. Beneath the roof, in the protected circle, nothing fell. The ground was clear, and at the exact edge of that circle, Reid saw them. Tracks. Dozens of them, all stopping at the same invisible line. Whatever was out there was getting more persistent, more interested. He glanced up at Maya's loft, at the canvas curtain that gave her privacy. She'd come here not knowing about any of this. She thought her father was just an eccentric hermit building weird structures in the wilderness. She had no idea that the structure was all that stood between them and something that wanted, very much, to get inside. Reid returned to his sleeping bag, but didn't sleep. He lay listening to his daughter breathe in the darkness above him and to the things that circled in the darkness outside, and wondered how long he could keep her safe from truths he barely understood himself. 3 days passed in careful negotiation of shared space. Maya remained guarded, but the sharp edges of her anger had dulled slightly. She drew constantly, filling page after page of her sketchbook with studies of the cabin, the forest, the mysterious double roof. Reid cooked, maintained the stove, gave her room to adjust. On the fourth morning, he suggested they walk the property boundaries together. Maya agreed with a shrug, pulling on the warmer coat he'd bought her in Ironwood. The property was roughly rectangular, 23 acres of mixed forest and rocky outcroppings. Reid had walked every foot of it during his first weeks here, mapping it in his mind the way he'd learned to map building sites, understanding the lay of the land, where water would flow, where structures would sit naturally. He'd also found the boundary markers. They were stones, each about the size of a basketball, partially buried and easy to miss if you weren't looking. But once you saw one, you saw them all. They formed a perfect circle around the property, each stone equidistant from its neighbors. 23 stones in total. Reid led Maya to the first one on the northern edge. It sat beside a lightning-struck pine covered in lichen and moss. He brushed the growth away, revealing carved symbols on its surface. Maya knelt to look closer. What is that, those markings? I don't know. They're old, though. Maybe 100 years, maybe more. Maya pulled out her phone. She'd been keeping it charged with the solar setup, though it was useless for communication out here, and took photos. Her artistic eye immediately caught what Reid had missed. The symbols weren't random. They repeated with variation, like letters in an alphabet. There's a pattern, she said, snapping pictures from multiple angles. See? This curved mark appears on every stone, but the marks around it change. It's almost like each stone is a word in a sentence. Reid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. You can see that just by looking. It's composition, visual rhythm. You probably see it in buildings, patterns in windows, spacing in columns. She glanced up at him. You really never noticed? I saw the stones, measured the distances between them, but I didn't see the pattern. They walked the perimeter, finding each stone. Maya photographed them all, making notes in her sketchbook about the symbol variations. When they'd completed the circuit and returned to the cabin, she spread her photos out on the table, arranging them in order. It's beautiful, she said softly, tracing the progression of symbols. Whoever carved these knew what they were doing. This isn't random protection magic or whatever. This is intentional design. Reid looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw something he'd forgotten. How bright she was, how naturally she understood visual language. He'd been so focused on his own failures as a father that he'd stopped seeing her as a person with her own gifts. You have a good eye for this, he said. Maya didn't respond, but he saw the slight softening around her eyes. They sat together in silence, studying the photographs. After a while, Maya said, So are you going to keep pretending this is all normal, or are you going to tell me what's really going on? Reid took a breath. This was the moment. He could keep deflecting, or he could trust her with at least part of the truth. I didn't come here randomly, he started. I mean, I did. I bought the land without seeing it. But once I got here, I found things, evidence that this place is unusual. Unusual how? Strange animal behavior, weather patterns that don't make sense, and a journal. He got up, retrieved Hollis's journal from where he kept it wrapped in canvas, and handed it to Maya. This was buried on the property. It's a surveyor's log from 1887. Maya opened it carefully, her artist's hands gentle with the fragile pages. She read silently for several minutes, her expression growing more focused. When she looked up, her face was serious. He thought something was here, something dangerous. Or he was losing his mind in isolation. That's also possible. But you believe him. That's why you built the double roof. Reid nodded. The journal had sketches. Indigenous design, apparently. A roof to protect against... He stopped, not sure how to finish. Against what? I don't know, that's the truth. I built it because it felt necessary, and I can't explain why. Maya closed the journal, handed it back. You know this sounds completely insane, right? I know. And you know Mom sent me here, thinking you were just depressed and hiding in the woods, not that you were building supernatural shelters based on century-old journals written by possibly crazy people. I know that too. Maya was quiet for a long moment. Then, the snow thing is real, though. I noticed it yesterday. It's been snowing on and off for days, but the ground under the upper roof stays clear. Not melted, just clear. Like it never falls there. Reid felt something in his chest constrict. He'd been so careful not to point that out, hoping she wouldn't notice. You saw that? I see everything. I'm an artist. We notice details. She looked at him, and for the first time since arriving, her expression was more curious than angry. What else have you seen? Reid hesitated. Then, tracks. In the snow. They come up to the edge of the protected area and stop. Every morning, they're there. Every morning, they stop at the same invisible boundary. Tracks from what? I don't know. They don't match any animal I recognize. Maya absorbed this, her face thoughtful. Can I see them? Tomorrow morning? If they appear again, yes. They made dinner together, and this time Maya talked while they cooked. She told him about school, about the fights that got her suspended. One with a boy who'd grabbed her inappropriately. One with a teacher who dismissed her artwork as unfocused rebellion. Mom said I was out of control, Maya said, stirring the pot of stew Reid had started. But I wasn't out of control. I was just done with people treating me like I didn't matter. Reid heard the echo of his own feelings in her words, the anger that came from being unseen, unheard. I understand that. More than you probably think. Is that why you left? Because you were done? Partly. Mostly because I'd failed you and I didn't know how to fix it. Maya was quiet. Then, you know what the worst part was? Not that you were gone. That you were there but absent at the same time. Like you were haunting your own life. The accuracy of that description hit Reid like a physical blow. You're right, I was. So why come here? How does hiding in Montana fix haunting yourself? It doesn't, but out here, at least I'm not haunting anyone else. They ate dinner as darkness fell. Maya asked questions about the cabin's construction, and Reid explained his choices, why he'd oriented it facing south for passive solar heat, why he'd used particular joints in the log work, why he'd positioned the stove where he had. She listened with genuine interest, and he realized they were having the first real conversation they'd had in years, maybe ever. No Jennifer mediating, no therapist taking notes, no judge evaluating. Just a father and daughter talking about how things fit together. That night, Reid woke to a sound, not the usual whispers, but something new, a scratching, persistent and rhythmic. He got up quietly and looked out. The moon was full. In its light, he could see clearly beneath the upper roof's shadow, and at the boundary line, something was testing the barrier, not breaching it, but pressing against it, over and over, like hands pushing against invisible glass. He watched for 10 minutes, his heart pounding. Then he heard movement behind him. Maya had climbed down from her loft and now stood beside him at the window. I hear it too, she whispered. Every night, I just didn't want to tell you I was scared. Reid put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, felt her lean into him slightly, and together they watched the darkness test the edges of the protection he'd built. Whatever was out there, it was getting more persistent. And winter had only just begun. The visitor arrived on a Tuesday morning, walking up the trail as though she'd been expected. Reid saw her first, an elderly woman moving through the forest with the confident stride of someone who knew these woods intimately. She wore traditional dress, layers of fabric and leather, her long gray hair braided down her back. A large pack was slung over her shoulders. He stepped outside as she entered, the clearing. Maya followed, curious. The woman stopped at the edge of the protected circle, looking up at the double roof with an expression Reid couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe. Or recognition. "You built it right," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. "That's good. The old surveyor left good instructions." Reid felt his throat tighten. "You know about Hollis?" "My grandfather knew him. Before the surveyor went away, he learned from our people. Not everything. He was white and some knowledge isn't for sharing. But enough." She looked at Reid, her dark eyes sharp despite her age. "I'm Sarah Crowfeather. This land belonged to my ancestors. I've been waiting to see who would finally build the protection." Maya stepped forward. "You know what this is? The roof?" Sarah's attention shifted to Maya, and something in her expression changed. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. "Yes, child. I know what it is. May I come closer?" Reid nodded. Sarah crossed the boundary line without hesitation, and Reid felt oddly relieved that she could. Whatever the barrier stopped, it wasn't human. She set down her pack and pulled out a rolled piece of hide, old and cracked with age. When she unrolled it on the ground, Reid saw it was a map, hand-drawn, detailed, showing the area around his property. "This is a threshold place," Sarah said, tracing the map with one weathered finger. "The boundaries between this world and others are thin here, always have been. My people knew this. We maintained the protections, kept the balance." "Protections?" Reid asked. "The stones?" "The stones marked the circle, but the protection needed more. A shelter with a false ceiling, so that what drifts through from the other side doesn't see the life below, doesn't smell the warmth, the blood, the living heartbeat." Sarah looked up at the double roof. "In the old times, we maintained 3 such shelters in this region. This was the last one. When my people were forced to leave, the shelter fell. The land became dangerous." Maya knelt beside the map. "Dangerous how?" Sarah's expression grew grave. "In winter, when the barrier is thinnest, things drift through. Not alive, not dead. Something in between. They were people once, long ago, but they stayed too long in the cold places between worlds. Now they're just hunger and confusion, seeking warmth they can no longer feel." Reid thought of the tracks, the pressing sensation against the barrier, the whispers. "I've seen signs of them. Every night. They'll test the protection all winter. They've been without prey for a long time. Your presence here draws them." Sarah looked at Maya again, that strange concern returning. Especially her. "Why me?" Maya asked. Sarah hesitated, then pulled a second item from her pack. A smaller piece of hide, this one showing detailed symbols. The same symbols carved on the boundary stones, but with annotations in what looked like multiple languages. "Some people can see more than others," Sarah said carefully. "Some are born with eyes that look into the thin places. Your drawings—" She gestured to Maya's sketchbook, which lay open on the cabin steps. "You see the patterns, the spaces between things. That's rare." Maya stared at her sketches, the obsessive studies of the double roof, the careful notation of the boundary stones. "I just noticed details. You notice what most people can't see. That's different." Sarah touched one of the symbols on the hide map. "This mark means one who sees. It appears on 3 of the boundary stones. The surveyor noted it in his journal. He wondered if it meant the person who carved them could see into the drift." "Can you?" Reid asked. "A little. My grandmother could see clearly. It drove her to sadness, seeing them out there, confused and hungry, unable to help them find their way back." Sarah looked at Maya with something like pity. "The gift can be a burden." Maya's face had gone pale. "Are you saying I can see ghosts or something?" "Not ghosts. The drifters aren't dead. They're displaced, lost between here and elsewhere. And yes, child, you can probably see them if you look. The question is whether you want to." Reid stepped forward. protective. She doesn't need to see anything. The roof keeps them out. That's enough. Sarah nodded slowly. For now, yes. But you should know. Others are interested in this place. The Surveyor's Journal wasn't the only record. There are people who know about threshold places, who want to use them. Use them how? Reid asked. The drift connects to places without time, without distance. If you could control the threshold, you could transport things. People, information. There's been talk for years. Developers, government interests, corporations with more money than sense. They all want to open the thresholds, use them like tunnels. Reid thought of the development company documents he'd found tucked into Hollis's journal. Hearthstone Development, with its mysterious backers and persistent attempts to purchase this exact land. Someone tried to buy this property before I did, he said. Multiple attempts, according to the records. All blocked somehow. My people have been using every legal method we can find to keep this land protected. But we're running out of options. Money talks louder than ancestral rights. Sarah rolled up her maps. That's why I'm glad you built the protection, but you need to understand. You've put yourself in the middle of something larger than one winter of drifters pressing against your roof. Maya looked between them. So what do we do? Maintain the protection, watch for strangers, and... Sarah hesitated, then spoke directly to Maya. If you start seeing them clearly, the drifters, don't be afraid. They can't hurt you. They're just lost. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is acknowledge them without letting them in. She shouldered her pack and turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Your presence here, both of you, strengthens the protection. The shelter works best when it shelters something worth protecting. Family, love, living connection. These things create barriers that even the drift respects. Sarah left the way she'd come, disappearing into the forest with the same purposeful stride. Reid and Maya stood in the clearing, processing what they'd learned. The morning sun had risen fully now, bright and cold. Do you believe her? Maya asked finally. About the drifters? The threshold? Yes. I've seen too much not to. Reid looked at his daughter. About you being able to see them? I don't know. Do you think you can? Maya stared out at the forest, at the spaces between the trees where light filtered through in strange patterns. I think I've been seeing something my whole life. I just thought it was imagination. Artists see things that aren't there, right? We make things up. Or maybe you see things that are there but that other people miss. They went back inside. Maya made coffee while Reid stoked the fire. They moved around each other with growing familiarity, the awkwardness of the first days fading into something more like partnership. That afternoon, Maya sketched the symbols from the boundary stones, trying to decode their pattern. Reid worked on reinforcing the upper roof's support posts, ensuring they could withstand the weight of heavy snow. They were preparing for siege without quite acknowledging it. But they were preparing together. As darkness fell, Reid noticed Maya kept glancing toward the windows, toward the spaces where the lamplight didn't reach. You okay? He asked. I keep thinking I see movement, just at the edge of my vision. That's normal here. The forest plays tricks with perception. No. Maya's voice was quiet, but certain. It's not the forest. Sarah was right. I can see them, not clearly, not yet. But they're there, pressing in. Reid came to stand beside her, and together they looked out into the winter darkness, where things that were neither dead nor alive circled the shelter his hands had built, and his daughter's presence had strengthened. The protection held. For now. 2 weeks after Sarah's visit, Reid finally showed Maya the complete Surveyor's Journal. They sat together at the table, the fragile pages spread between them, while snow fell outside, everywhere except beneath their protective roof. Maya read with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Her fingers traced Hollis's increasingly frantic handwriting, pausing on the sketches, lingering on the passages that described the entities. "He saw them clearly," she said, reading one entry aloud. "They gather at dusk, forms that suggest human shape but lack substance. When I look directly at them, they seem to vanish, but in my peripheral vision they remain, pressing, always pressing, seeking entry to warmth and light they remember but can no longer possess." She looked up at Reid. "That's exactly what I see, at the edges of my vision. Shapes that disappear when I look straight at them." "Does it frighten you?" Maya considered this. "It should, but it mostly just makes me sad. Sarah was right. They're not evil. They're lost." Reid pulled out another document he'd been hiding. The papers he'd found tucked into the journal's back cover. Development proposals from Hearthstone Development, dating back 15 years, attempts to purchase the land, all mysteriously blocked. Surveys that mentioned unique geological properties and potential for advanced research applications. "I've been thinking about what Sarah said, about people wanting to use the threshold." He spread out the documents. "This company has been trying to acquire this property for years. Why?" Maya studied the papers with her artist's eye for detail. "Look at the language they use. Transport Research Facility. Dimensional Study Site. Threshold Utilization Project. They know exactly what this place is." "But how? Hollis kept his journal private. Sarah's people have been protecting this knowledge. Maybe there are other journals. Other surveyors who didn't go away like Hollis did." Maya pointed to a clause in one of the contracts. "And look, they're not just offering to buy. They're threatening eminent domain. They have government backing." Reid felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. "If they can claim the land serves a national interest, they could force us out, take the property, tear down your protection, and do whatever they want with the threshold." Maya closed the journal carefully. "We need to know more. About them. About what they're really planning." Reid's old laptop sat on the shelf, mostly unused. The satellite internet connection was spotty at best, expensive and maddeningly slow. But that night, they fired it up and began searching. Hearthstone Development was a shell company, that much was clear quickly. Multiple layers of subsidiary corporations, all tracing back to a private equity firm called Threshold Holdings. The irony of the name wasn't lost on Reid. "They're not even hiding it," Maya said, scrolling through search results. "Threshold Holdings has invested in dozens of properties with documented supernatural activity. Haunted locations, sites of unexplained phenomena, places where people report reality distortions." Reid found a news article from 3 years prior. A researcher at MIT had published a paper theorizing about thin places in space-time where the normal rules of physics might not apply. The paper had been quickly retracted, but not before generating significant interest. The researcher's name was Marcus Webb. He'd left MIT and now worked as chief science officer for Threshold Holdings. "This is bigger than we thought," Reid said. "They're not just land speculators. They're trying to weaponize these places." Maya pulled up a cached version of Webb's retracted paper. It was dense with equations and theoretical physics, but the core argument was clear. If threshold places could be identified and controlled, they could theoretically be used for instantaneous transport, communication across vast distances, even time manipulation. "He's talking about turning thin places into tools," Maya said, "forcing open the drift and using it." Reid thought about the drifters pressing against his protection every night. What happens to the things already in the drift if you force it open? Nothing good, probably. Maya closed the laptop. "We need to tell Sarah. She has to know that Hearthstone has government backing now." They tried calling the number Sarah had left, but the satellite phone couldn't get a signal. The storm outside had intensified, bringing the kind of heavy snow that turned the forest into a maze of white. "We'll have to wait," Reid said. "The trail's impassable in this weather." That night, the pressure against the protection increased. Reid could feel it, a tension in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Maya, sitting by the window with her sketchbook, began drawing what she saw in the spaces between darkness and light. The drawings were haunting. Figures that were almost human but wrong somehow. Proportions subtly off. Features blurred as though seen through distorted glass. She drew them pressing against an invisible barrier, hands splayed against nothing, mouths open in silent calls. "There are so many," she whispered. "I didn't realize. All winter I've been seeing just the edges. But now—" Her hand moved faster, capturing form after form. "There are dozens of them. Maybe more. All drawn here by our warmth, our life." Reid came to stand behind her, looking at the drawings. Each figure was different, but all shared that quality of displacement, of being lost between states of existence. Hollis wrote about this, Reid said, remembering a passage from late in the journal. He said that in deep winter, when the threshold is widest, the drifters cluster so thick you could almost walk through them without touching living air. What happened to him? The journal just stops. I don't know. Sarah said he went away. Whether that means he left or... Reid didn't finish the thought. Or he became one of them, Maya completed. Stayed too long, drifted too close to the threshold, and lost his way back. The thought hung heavy between them. How thin was the line between observer and observed, between documenting the threshold and becoming part of it. A sound outside made them both turn, not the usual whispers or scratching, but something mechanical. An engine, multiple engines, struggling through the snow. Reid grabbed his coat and flashlight. Maya followed. They stepped outside into the protected circle, and in the distance, through the trees, they saw lights, headlights from vehicles that shouldn't be able to navigate these roads in this storm. "They're here," Maya said. "Hearthstone." The vehicles stopped about half a mile away, as close as the terrain would allow. Reid watched through his old binoculars as figures in heavy winter gear began unloading equipment. One figure stood apart from the others, not helping, but directing. Even at this distance, Reid recognized the confident posture of someone used to being obeyed. The man pulled out a satellite phone and made a call, his breath visible in the cold air. Then he turned and looked directly at Reid's position, as though he could see across the distance and darkness, as though he'd known exactly where to look. Reid lowered the binoculars, his heart pounding. "We need to reinforce the protection. If they're coming tomorrow, we need to be ready." They worked through the night. Reid checked every support post, every connection point in the double-roof structure. Maya walked the boundary line with her flashlight, examining each carved stone, looking for damage or displacement. At the eastern boundary, she found something that made her call out for Reid. One of the stones had been disturbed. Not moved exactly, but the ground around it had been excavated and refilled. Someone had been here, recently, examining the protection's foundation. "They've been scouting us," Maya said, "testing the boundaries, learning how it works." Reid knelt beside the stone, his mind racing through defensive possibilities. The protection was ancient knowledge, but it was also architecture, and architecture could be reinforced, improved, adapted. "Tomorrow we're going to have visitors," he said, "and they're going to try to take what we've built, try to tear down the protection and open the threshold." Can they do that? Reid thought about everything he knew about structures, about forces and counterforces, about how things fail and how they endure. Anything can be broken if you understand it well enough, but anything can also be defended if you're willing to fight for it. Maya looked at her father in the flashlight's glow. "We're really doing this, standing against a company with government backing and who knows what kind of resources." "Yes, we are. Why? We could just leave. Let them have this place." Reid looked back at the cabin, at the double roof that cast its protective shadow over the small space they'd made livable together. "Because some things need to be protected," Not exploited, not weaponized. Just left alone to do what they've always done. Keep the lost things at bay and give the living a place to heal. He looked at his daughter. And because for the first time in years, I have something worth fighting for. Someone worth fighting for. Maya's expression softened in the darkness. Then she nodded. Okay, then we fight. They returned to the cabin as dawn began to break. The storm had passed, leaving the world white and pristine. The vehicles in the distance sat silent, waiting. Inside, Reid began planning their defense. He was an architect. He understood structures, weaknesses, strengths. He'd spent months studying this. Protection, understanding how it functioned. Now he would use every bit of that knowledge to ensure it held. Maya made breakfast while Reid sketched reinforcement plans. They ate in focused silence, both understanding that something fundamental was about to change. When the sun fully rose, they saw the figures from the vehicles beginning their trek toward the cabin. 6 people in technical gear, carrying equipment Reid couldn't identify, and at the front, the man who'd looked directly at their position in the darkness. They were coming, and Reid and Maya were ready. The visitors arrived at mid-morning, stopping at the edge of the protected circle. 6 people in expensive cold-weather gear, their equipment cases gleaming in the winter sun. The man in front was younger than Reid had expected. Maybe 40, with the kind of careful grooming that spoke of money and position. "Mr. Mallow," the man called out. "I'm Marcus Webb, Threshold Holdings. May we approach?" Reid stepped outside, Maya behind him. "You're on private property." "Technically, we're at the property line. But we'd like to talk. May we come closer? It's difficult to negotiate across 50 yards of snow." Reid hesitated, then nodded. Webb and 2 others stepped forward, leaving the rest behind with the equipment. Up close, Webb had the intense, slightly manic look of someone who'd stared too long at problems that had no solutions. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands restless. "Impressive work," Webb said, looking up at the double roof. "You followed Hollis's designs, almost exactly. Though I notice you've made some improvements. The support structure is more robust than the original." "What do you want?" Rudd asked flatly. "To make you an offer. A very generous offer. $5 million for the property, plus relocation assistance, plus a consulting contract if you're interested in the work we're doing." "Not interested." Webb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You haven't heard the details of the work yet. We're on the verge of something revolutionary. Controlled threshold manipulation, instantaneous transport across vast distances, the kind of breakthrough that changes civilization." "By ripping open the drift and letting lost things through?" Maya asked. "That's your breakthrough?" Webb's attention shifted to her, and something in his expression changed. A flash of surprise, then fascination. "You can see them, the drifters. You have the sight." "Don't talk to her," Reid said sharply. "It's rare, you know, the ability to perceive threshold phenomena directly. My research suggests less than 1% of the population has it." Webb took a step closer to Maya. "How clearly can you see them? Just impressions or actual forms?" Maya lifted her chin. "Clear enough to know they don't want to be experimented on." Webb laughed, a harsh sound. "They're not conscious entities. They're quantum fluctuations, probability matrices that collapsed into pseudo-physical forms. They don't want anything because they can't want." "You're wrong," Maya said quietly. "They were people once. They're lost. That's different from being nothing." Something flickered across Webb's face. Pain, quickly suppressed. "You sound like my daughter. She used to say things like that." The past tense hung in the air. Reid felt his stomach drop. "What happened to her?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Webb was quiet for a long moment. 7 years ago, I brought my family to a threshold site in Vermont for research. Sarah was 12. Brilliant, sensitive, artistic. Like you, he said to Maya. She could see the drifters too. She wanted to help them. One night she went out into the drift alone, trying to guide one back. We found her body 3 days later. She'd frozen to death, but his voice broke. The expression on her face. She looked lost, confused, like she couldn't find her way home. Reid understood then. The obsession, the need to control the threshold, the refusal to see the drifters as anything but data. Webb wasn't trying to exploit the phenomenon. He was trying to punish it. "I'm sorry," Reid said, meaning it. "But that doesn't justify what you're planning. Opening the threshold won't bring her back." "No, but it might prevent other families from losing their children to something we don't understand." Webb's intensity ratcheted up. "Don't you see? Your protection is just a band-aid. It hides from the problem instead of solving it. My work could close the thresholds permanently, seal the drifters away, make places like this safe. Or it could tear everything open and make it worse," Maya said. Webb pulled out a tablet, showed them simulations, complex models of threshold dynamics, probability curves, energy distributions. "We've been studying this for years. We know what we're doing." Reid looked at the models and saw architecture of a sort. Forces and counterforces, structural integrity applied to space-time itself. Webb's approach was brute force. Overwhelm the threshold with energy. Force it closed through sheer power. It would never work. Reid knew that instinctively, the way he knew a building design was flawed before running the calculations. You couldn't force thresholds any more than you could force water to flow uphill. You could only guide, channel, work with the natural tendencies. Before Reid could articulate this, something happened that changed everything. A massive blizzard rolled in with impossible speed, going from clear skies to whiteout conditions in minutes. The temperature plummeted. Wind shrieked through the forest, driving snow so thick Reid couldn't see 10 feet. Webb and his people scrambled for the cabin's protection, and Reid, despite his better judgment, let them inside. Freezing people to death would solve nothing. Crowded into the small space, 8 people now where 2 had lived comfortably, the cabin felt claustrophobic. Webb's team set up emergency heaters, professional to their core, even in crisis. The storm raged outside, but beneath the double roof, the protection held. The temperature stayed bearable. The structure stood firm. Maya had retreated to her loft with her sketchbook. Reid noticed her drawing frantically, her face pale with concentration. Then she climbed down, holding a page she'd just completed. It was a drawing of the cabin, the property, the boundary stones, but with one addition, a date written in her careful hand at the bottom, February 12th, 1993. "What is this?" Reid asked. "A memory, except I wasn't born until 2009. Maya's voice shook, but I remember this place. I remember being here as a baby, not just visiting, being born here." Reid felt the world tilt. "That's impossible. You were born in Boston, at Mass General. I was there." "Are you sure, really sure?" Maya's eyes were wide. "Or do you just remember being told that? Because I've been having dreams since I got here. Fragments that feel like memories. And I drew this before I even thought about it. My hand just moved." Reid's mind raced back. The custody hearing, Jennifer's testimony, the therapist's reports. But before all that, what did he actually remember about Maya's birth? Fragments, disjointed images, a camping trip that went wrong. Jennifer in labor, too early. A stranger who helped. Authorities who found no record. He'd suppressed those memories, convinced himself they were stress-induced confusion, but now. Reid went to his own carefully organized papers, the ones he'd brought from Boston in a waterproof box, his important documents, birth certificates, passport, deed to the property. He found Maya's birth certificate and stared at it with fresh eyes. The hospital was listed. The date, the attending physician. All standard information. But then Reid noticed something he'd never questioned before. The filing date was 2 weeks after the birth date, and there was a small notation in the corner. Corrected record, original filed in error. What does that mean? Maya asked, reading over his shoulder. Webb, listening from across the room, stood up suddenly. May I see that? Reid almost refused, but something in Webb's expression made him hand over the document. Webb examined it with professional scrutiny. This is an amended birth certificate. See this code? It means the original was sealed. Usually that happens with adoptions or when there are legal complications around the birth circumstances. I'm not adopted, Maya said. No, but you might have been born somewhere other than where your parents reported. Webb pulled out his phone, started typing despite the lack of signal. This is recorded locally. Give me a minute. He went to his equipment cases, pulled out a satellite communication device, and began accessing databases with the kind of clearance that confirmed every suspicion Reid had about Threshold Holdings' government connections. 5 minutes later, Webb looked up, his expression stunned. According to sealed medical records I probably shouldn't be able to access, Maya Jennifer Mallow was born on February 12, 1993, at approximately 3:47 a.m. during a medical emergency at... He read the GPS coordinates, then looked at Reid. These coordinates, this property. Your daughter was born here, on a threshold site, under circumstances classified as unexplained. The cabin went silent except for the wind howling outside. Maya sank into a chair. I don't understand. Why would they lie about where I was born? Reid's memory was unlocking now, pieces falling into place. We were camping. Your mother was 5 months pregnant, but she wanted one last adventure before you came. We were in Montana, nowhere near here, but... He stopped, realization hitting. We got lost, completely disoriented. Ended up somewhere that felt wrong. Your mother went into labor suddenly. We found a cabin, an old shelter with a strange roof. This cabin, Maya whispered. No, this is new. I built this, but... Reid looked at the double roof. Maybe the old protection stood here. Maybe we found it and that's where you were born. Webb was scrolling through more data. The original Responding Emergency Services report is bizarre. They describe finding a couple with a newborn, but the couple couldn't explain how they got to that location or why the baby was already delivered when they'd only gone into labor an hour before. Time displacement, possibly. Threshold effects can warp chronology. But why seal the records? Maya asked. Because someone noticed the anomaly. Someone from the government, probably the same people who've been tracking threshold sites for decades. Webb looked at Reid. You didn't randomly buy this land. Your subconscious remembered it. You were drawn back. And Maya, Reid said, understanding flooding through him. When she arrived, the protection strengthened. Sarah said our presence made it stronger, but it's not just presence. Maya was born here, on this threshold. She's connected to it in a way neither of us understood. Maya stared at her hands, at the drawings she'd been making compulsively since arriving. All of them about this place, about the threshold, about the lost things between worlds. I'm not just seeing the drifters, she said slowly. They're drawn to me because I'm... What? Part of the threshold? No, Webb said firmly. You're anchored to it. Born in a thin place, you became a kind of human boundary marker. The drifters recognize you as part of the protection, not as prey. He paused. That's why my daughter died. She tried to help, but she had no connection to the threshold. You're part of it. You could walk into the drift and find your way back. Don't even think about it, Reid said immediately. I don't care what she's connected to. She's not going near the drift. But I could help them, Maya said, looking at her father with dawning understanding. I could guide them. That's why I see them so clearly. That's why they respond to me. I'm supposed to help them find their way back. Webb shook his head violently. That's what Sarah thought. That's what got her killed. The blizzard continued to rage, and in the protection of the double roof, 3 people confronted a truth that changed everything. Maya wasn't just Reid's daughter who happened to be here. She was connected to this place at a fundamental level, tied to the threshold in ways that made her both more powerful and more vulnerable than any of them had understood. The question was what to do with that knowledge, and whether the drifters pressing ever closer against the protection understood what she was too. The blizzard lasted 3 days. Webb and his team were trapped in the cabin with Reid and Maya, the space that had felt cozy for 2 becoming cramped and tense with 8. But something unexpected happened during those 3 days. An alliance formed. Webb, confronted with the truth about Maya's connection to the threshold, underwent a visible transformation. The manic energy that had driven him faded, replaced by something more thoughtful, more human. On the 2nd night, while the others slept, he and Reid talked by the stove's dying light. "I've spent 7 years trying to destroy what killed my daughter," Webb said quietly. "Building weapons against the drift. But I've been fighting the wrong battle, haven't I?" Reid considered his words carefully. "I think you've been fighting grief. That's different from fighting the actual problem. The problem being that the thresholds exist and we don't understand them. The problem being that we try to make them into something they're not. You want to close them. Hearthstone wants to weaponize them. Neither approach respects what they actually are. Boundaries that serve a purpose we probably can't fully comprehend." Webb stared into the stove. "Sarah used to say that. She said the drifters weren't the enemy, just the symptom of something broken that needed healing, not fighting. Your daughter sounds like she was wise. She was 12. Webb's voice cracked. "She shouldn't have had to be wise. She should have been thinking about middle school and friends and normal kid things. Instead, she was worrying about lost souls between worlds." Reid thought of Maya, drawing compulsively in her loft, seeing things no teenager should have to see. "I understand that, more than you probably think." When the blizzard finally broke on the 4th morning, the world outside was transformed. Snow had piled into drifts that obscured the familiar landscape. But beneath the double roof, the ground remained clear, a perfect circle of protection in a sea of white. Webb's team began preparing to leave, but Webb himself lingered. He pulled out his tablet and showed Reid something he'd been working on during the storm. "These are the plans for Hearthstone's threshold manipulation device," he said. "I designed most of it. It's meant to generate a massive electromagnetic pulse that would, theoretically, force the threshold to collapse. Theoretically. I've been running new models, with what we've learned about Maya, about how the threshold actually functions." He swiped through screens of equations. It wouldn't close the threshold. It would shatter it, turn one controlled thin place into a dozen uncontrolled rifts. The drifters would pour through everywhere. Reid felt cold. "How certain are you?" 90%. Maybe more. Webb looked haunted. "If Hearthstone deploys this device, it won't protect anyone. It'll destroy the natural balance that's kept the drift contained for centuries. Can you stop them?" "I'm the chief science officer. I have influence. But Threshold Holdings has invested hundreds of millions in this project. The board wants results." He hesitated. "There's something else. They know about Maya." Reid's head snapped up. "How?" "I haven't told them specifics, but they monitor my research. They know I found evidence of someone with strong threshold sensitivity at this location. They'll come looking. Maybe not this week, but soon." "Then we need to be ready," Maya said from her loft. She'd been awake, listening. "Not just to defend the cabin, to prove there's a better way." She climbed down, carrying her sketchbook. During the storm, she'd been drawing more than idle studies. She'd been drafting plans. What if we strengthen the protection instead of just maintaining it? She spread out drawings that showed the boundary stones, the double roof, and new additions. what looked like architectural modifications combined with the symbolic patterns from the stones. Dad, you understand structural engineering. Dr. Webb, you understand the physics of the threshold. I can see how the drift responds to barriers. Together, we could build something better than just hiding. Webb studied her drawings with growing interest. You're proposing to expand the protection, make it stronger, more permanent, and use it to help the drifters, Maya added. Not trap them, not exploit them. Help them find their way back to whatever they came from. That's, Webb paused, recalculating. Actually possible, if the threshold functions as a boundary rather than a barrier, with the right harmonic frequencies. He and Maya began talking rapidly, trading ideas that were half architecture, half physics, all innovation. Reid listened, watching his daughter hold her own with a PhD scientist, her artistic vision translating complex concepts into visual language Webb could work with. Sarah Crowfeather arrived on the 5th day, appearing out of the forest with 2 other indigenous elders. She took one look at Webb and his equipment, and her expression hardened. "You brought them here," she said to Reid. "The people who want to break the threshold." "Not exactly," Reid started, but Webb stepped forward. "I came to threaten them," Webb said bluntly, "to force them off the land so we could deploy our device. But I was wrong. About everything." Sarah studied him with eyes that seemed to see through pretense. "The grief, Father. I remember you. Your daughter died at the Vermont site." Webb flinched. "Yes. She was trying to heal what your presence had disturbed. She had the gift, like this one." Sarah gestured to Maya. But no training, no understanding. Her compassion was greater than her wisdom. "I know. And I've spent 7 years trying to make the drift pay for that. But I've learned—" Webb's voice strengthened. "I've learned that revenge against a natural phenomenon is meaningless. The drift isn't evil. It's just there. And these 2, he indicated Reid and Maya, they've shown me there might be another way." Sarah listened as they explained Maya's connection to the threshold, her birth on this site, the strengthened protection her presence created. Then she listened to their plan to expand and enhance the protection, to create not just a shelter, but a guidepost for the drifters. When they finished, she was quiet for a long time. The other elders whispered together in their language. Finally, Sarah spoke. "This was the old way. Before my people were forced from this land, we didn't just hide from the drift. We served as guides. The threshold keepers would help the lost ones find their way back to the places between places, back to peace." "Can we do that again?" Maya asked. "With you as the keeper? Perhaps. You were born to this threshold. You see clearly. And you have protection." She looked at Reid and Webb. "Both architectural and scientific. It might work. But there's a problem," one of the other elders said, speaking English with a heavy accent. "Hearthstone will not stop with one failed attempt. They have already surveyed this land. They know its value. They will return with force." Webb nodded grimly. "The board wants results by spring. If I can't show progress, they'll replace me and send someone who will deploy the device regardless of consequences." "Then we have until spring to prove there's a better way," Reid said. "Can we do it?" Sarah looked at the cabin, at the double roof, at the boundary stones. "The protection must be perfect, the threshold must be stabilized, and Maya must be trained to guide without being drawn into the drift herself." "I can teach her the science," Webb offered. "And I can teach her the architecture," Reid added. "And I will teach her the old ways," Sarah said. "But understand, what you're proposing is dangerous. If the protection fails while she's working with the drifters, she could be lost, and if Hearthstone comes while the threshold is open and active, they could destroy everything." Maya looked at each of them in turn. Her father, the scientist who'd lost his daughter, the elder who represented generations of threshold keepers. "I understand the risks, but I've been seeing the drifters since I was a child. I've been drawing them, dreaming about them, sensing them at the edges of my perception my whole life," If I was born for this, then hiding from it doesn't make sense. Reid wanted to protest, to lock his daughter safely in the cabin and let the rest of the world sort itself out. But he looked at her standing there, confident, purposeful, more herself than he'd ever seen her, and he realized that protecting her didn't mean keeping her from her calling. It meant giving her the tools to fulfill it safely. "Okay," he said. "We do this together, all of us." The alliance was sealed. Webb agreed to delay Hearthstone's deployment while helping strengthen the protection. Sarah and the elders agreed to provide traditional knowledge and support. Reid would engineer the structural improvements, and Maya would train to become what her birth had apparently prepared her for, a threshold keeper. They had 3 months until spring, when Hearthstone would expect results. 3 months to accomplish what hadn't been done in over a century. 3 months to build something that could protect this place not just for one winter, but permanently. The work began immediately. Webb brought legitimate research equipment, sensors to map the threshold's energy patterns, instruments to measure its fluctuations. Reid began drafting architectural plans for enhanced support structures that would strengthen the double roof and extend the protection. Sarah started teaching Maya the old songs, the old ways of calling to the lost without getting lost yourself. The cabin became a strange workshop where cutting-edge science met ancient wisdom, met architectural innovation. Webb's equations filled notebooks beside Maya's drawings, beside Sarah's traditional symbols. They worked through January, then into February. The drifters continued to press against the protection, but their behavior was changing. Maya, practicing the techniques Sarah taught her, began to sense patterns in their movements, intention in what had seemed like random wandering. "They're not trying to break in," she reported one evening. "They're trying to ask for help. They just don't remember how to ask." On Valentine's Day, they achieved their first success. Maya, standing at the boundary with Sarah guiding her, managed to establish contact with one of the drifters. Not physical contact. Something else. A recognition, an acknowledgement, a moment of connection that let the lost thing remember, just for an instant, what it had been seeking. The drifter moved away from the boundary, its form becoming less agitated, more peaceful. "It worked," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I felt it remember. Just for a moment, it knew where it needed to go." But success brought new danger. The moment of contact sent a surge through the threshold, a pulse of energy that Webb's sensors detected immediately. "That signal would be visible to anyone monitoring threshold activity," he said, staring at his instruments. "Hearthstone will have detected it. They'll know something significant happened here." Reid looked at his daughter, at the exhaustion and joy mixed on her face. "How long before they come?" "Days. Maybe a week if we're lucky." Webb began packing up the sensitive equipment. "They'll send a larger team. They'll bring the device, and they won't ask for permission this time." Sarah stood. "Then we must be ready. The protection must be completed. The threshold must be stabilized, and Maya must be prepared to prove that healing is stronger than breaking." The peaceful moment shattered. They were out of time. The siege they'd been preparing for was about to begin. They came at dawn 6 days later, not with stealth, but with overwhelming force. Reid heard the helicopters first, 2 of them, military-grade, landing in the clearing Webb's initial team had carved half a mile from the property. Then came the ground vehicles, somehow managing terrain that should have been impossible. Someone with money and government authorization had cleared an access route overnight. "How many?" Maya asked, standing beside him at the window. Webb, who'd stayed to help complete their work, counted through binoculars. 20 personnel. Heavy equipment and... His voice went flat. They brought the device. Reid saw it being unloaded. A complex machine the size of a cargo van, covered in antennas and what looked like massive electromagnetic coils. Even without understanding the technology, He could feel its wrongness, its fundamental opposition to the natural balance they'd been working to maintain. Sarah and the other elders had left 2 days ago to gather the wider community, promising to return with reinforcements. They weren't back yet. "It's just us," Maya said quietly. 3 people and incomplete protection. 4 people, a voice said from the doorway. They turned to see one of Webb's former team members, a young engineer named Chen who'd been part of the first visit. She carried a backpack and wore an expression of grim determination. "Dr. Webb," she said, "I couldn't let them do this. I've seen your revised calculations. If they activate that device here, the threshold won't close. It'll fracture. We'll have ruptures opening randomly across hundreds of miles." "Then why isn't anyone else listening?" Webb demanded. "Because the board doesn't care about the science anymore. They care about the investment. They've promised the military instant transport technology. They've promised investors returns. The truth doesn't matter when that much money is at stake." Reid watched the team outside assembling the device. They worked with military efficiency, setting up a perimeter, establishing a command center. This wasn't a negotiation force. This was an occupation. A loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention, occupants of the structure. You are trespassing on land under federal jurisdiction. You have 1 hour to evacuate before we begin operations." "They can't do that," Maya said. "This is private property." Webb's expression was grim. "Eminent domain. They must have pushed it through. Threshold Holdings has enough government connections to make it happen." "They're not taking this place," Reid said flatly. "We'll fight them." "With what? Hope and architecture?" Chen asked, not unkindly. "They have legal authority and enough firepower to handle resistance." "They have authority to occupy the land," Reid said, his architect's mind working through the problem structurally. "But they don't have authority over the threshold itself. That's not property. That's a natural phenomenon." Maya understood immediately. "If we can prove the device will cause catastrophic damage, not just to us, but to the surrounding area, that's an environmental issue. The EPA would have jurisdiction." "We'd need evidence," Webb said. "Real-time data showing what happens when—" He stopped, his eyes widening. "That's it. We let them activate the device, but we document exactly what happens. The threshold fracture, the energy cascade, the danger to everyone in the region." "You want to let them break the threshold?" Reid asked, horrified. "No. I want to let them try. But we'll have already stabilized it using Maya's method. Their device will fail spectacularly and dangerously enough to force federal intervention." "That's incredibly risky," Chen said. "If our stabilization isn't perfect, then we all die along with everyone else in a 50-mile radius when reality starts tearing itself apart." "Yes, I know." Webb looked at Maya. "Can you do it? Stabilize the threshold the way Sarah taught you. Keep it stable while they try to shatter it?" Maya's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady. "I can try." Outside, the tactical team was setting up the device's main components. They had 45 minutes before the 1-hour deadline expired. Reid began checking the double roof's integrity, every support post, every connection. Chen helped Webb calibrate sensors to record what was about to happen. Maya stood at the center of the protected circle, breathing slowly, preparing herself for what Sarah had taught her. The training had been rushed, incomplete. Sarah had warned them Maya wasn't ready for something this big. But ready or not, they were out of time. "They're powering up," Chen said, watching her instruments. "The device is generating its initial charge. When they hit full power, it'll release an electromagnetic pulse designed to collapse the threshold's quantum structure." "Which will instead shatter it," Webb said, "unless Maya can hold it together." Reid went to his daughter, put his hands on her shoulders. "You don't have to do this. We can evacuate, live to fight another way." Maya looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't seen in years: complete trust. "You built a shelter to protect me. Now I get to protect what you built. That's how this works, right? We protect each other." Before Reid could respond, the device outside began its final power-up sequence. A hum filled the air, growing louder, making his teeth ache, and his vision blur at the edges. "Everyone to your positions," Webb ordered. "Maya, start the stabilization. Reid, be ready to reinforce the physical structure when the energy hits. Chen, document everything." Maya closed her eyes and began to sing. One of the old songs Sarah had taught her, a melody that seemed to resonate with something deeper than sound. The device outside reached critical power, and the battle for the threshold began. The pulse hit like a physical blow, warping the air itself. Reid felt it in his bones, reality bending, the normal rules of space and time becoming suggestions rather than laws. The double roof groaned under stresses that had nothing to do with weight or wind. Maya's song never wavered. Her eyes were closed, her face serene despite the chaos erupting around them. Reid could see the threshold responding to her voice, to her presence, to whatever connection had been forged when she was born in this place 15 years ago. Outside, the device's operators were shouting in confusion. Their instruments showed the pulse had fired correctly, maximum power, perfect targeting. But the threshold wasn't collapsing. If anything, it was becoming more stable, more defined. "It's working," Webb breathed, watching his sensors. Maya's harmonizing with the threshold's natural frequency. Instead of being shattered by the pulse, it's using that energy to strengthen itself. But there was a cost. Reid saw it in the way Maya's hands shook, in the sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. She was serving as a conduit for massive energies, channeling them, directing them, keeping them from tearing everything apart. "She can't maintain this for long," Reid said. "She doesn't have to. Just long enough for—" Webb pointed at his instruments. "There. The device is burning out. They pushed it too hard, trying to overcome her resistance." Outside, alarms began blaring. The device's coils were glowing red-hot, smoke pouring from its housing. The tactical team scattered as components began failing explosively. But something else was happening. The threshold pulse, redirected and harmonized by Maya's efforts, was having an unexpected effect on the drifters. They were becoming visible, not just to Maya, but to everyone. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, their forms solidifying out of the spaces between air and light. The tactical team froze, staring at the impossible sight. Lost things, neither alive nor dead, pressing against boundaries they could finally see. And Maya, still singing, began to guide them. Reid watched in awe as his daughter, eyes still closed, started making gestures with her hands. Slow, graceful movements that seemed to draw patterns in the air. The drifters responded, their aimless pressing becoming purposeful movement. They were following her guidance, being led not away, but through. "She's opening a passage," Webb said, his voice hushed with wonder. "Not breaking the threshold, creating a door, a way for them to return to wherever they came from." One by one, the drifters began to fade, but not into nothing, into somewhere else, some other state of being that was finally, mercifully, right for what they'd become. The confusion in their movements gave way to something like peace. The device outside gave one final, catastrophic surge and died completely. Silence fell across the clearing, broken only by Maya's song, which was winding down now, coming to a natural close. When she finally opened her eyes, the threshold was still intact, stronger even. The boundary stones glowed faintly in patterns Reid had never seen before, symbols activating in sequence like a message being written in light. The tactical team's leader, a hard-faced woman in her 50s, approached the protected circle cautiously. She'd been recording everything on her phone. "What did we just witness?" she asked, her voice shaking. Webb stepped forward. "You witnessed a controlled threshold stabilization using harmonic resonance. Your device failed catastrophically, exactly as my revised calculations predicted. If the threshold hadn't been stabilized by trained personnel," he gestured to Maya, The energy release would have fractured reality across this entire region. Thousands dead. Uncontrollable rifts opening randomly for decades. The tactical leader looked at her destroyed device, at her team's shocked faces, at the slowly fading glow of the boundary stones. "I need to report this." "Please do," Webb said. "Report that Threshold Holdings nearly caused a catastrophe. Report that their approach was fundamentally flawed. And report that there's a better way, working with the Thresholds, not against them." Chen held up her recording equipment. "I have complete data. Temperature readings, energy signatures, threshold fluctuation patterns. Everything needed to prove this approach works, and theirs doesn't." Reid saw Sarah emerging from the forest, followed by dozens of her community members. They'd been waiting, watching, ready to intervene if needed. But Maya had managed it alone. The tactical leader made a call on her satellite phone. Reid couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the body language, the defensive posture giving way to resignation, then to something like relief. When she ended the call, she looked at them with an expression Reid couldn't quite identify. Respect, maybe, or exhaustion. "Hearthstone's operation is suspended pending federal investigation," she said. "You're to remain on site. EPA and Department of Energy are sending teams to assess. This whole thing just became a major incident." "Good," Webb said simply. "It should be." The tactical team began packing up their equipment, treating the destroyed device with the caution of people who'd just witnessed something beyond their training. Maya sat down heavily, and Reid rushed to her side. She looked exhausted but strangely peaceful. "I saw them find their way back," she said quietly. They weren't scary at the end, just grateful. Sarah knelt beside them. "You did what my people haven't been able to do in over a century. You kept the threshold and helped the lost. That's the old way, restored." The sun broke through the clouds, warming the winter clearing. The protection held. The threshold remained stable. And for the first time, Reid felt like they might actually survive this. Together. Spring came gently to the Montana wilderness, melting the snow in slow stages, revealing ground that had been hidden for months. Reid stood on the porch he'd built, an addition to the cabin, completed in March with Maya's help, and watched his daughter talking with a group of graduate students from the University of Montana. They'd come to study the threshold under the new federal protection order, and Maya had become an unofficial consultant, explaining what she'd learned about threshold dynamics. 3 months since the confrontation. 3 months of investigations, interviews, paperwork, and slowly building proof that their approach worked better than Hearthstone's ever could. The company had collapsed spectacularly. The board's attempt to cover up the device's failure had backfired when Chen's data went public. Multiple federal agencies had opened investigations. Investors had fled. Within 6 weeks, Threshold Holdings had dissolved into bankruptcy and lawsuits. Webb had testified before Congress, explaining the science behind threshold protection and why weaponizing these sites would be catastrophic. His daughter's story, shared publicly for the first time, had moved people in ways that data never could. Now he ran a new research institute. Small, non-profit, focused on understanding threshold sites without exploiting them. He visited the property once a month, bringing students, collecting data, learning. The cabin had grown too. Reid had added 2 more rooms, a proper bathroom with a composting toilet, solar panels that provided enough power for computers and equipment. It was still remote, still isolated, but it was no longer a hermit's retreat. It had become something else. A center, a gathering place, a home. Sarah Crowfeather sat at the table inside, teaching a class to indigenous youth from 3 different communities. The old knowledge was being preserved, passed on to a new generation who would serve as threshold keepers across the region. Maya had enrolled in online school but spent most of her time here, learning both the traditional ways from Sarah and the scientific methods from Webb. She'd found a path that honored both ways of understanding, the ancient and the modern, the intuitive and the analytical. Jennifer had visited once, in April. The meeting had been awkward, tense, full of old wounds barely scabbed over. But she'd seen Maya, confident, purposeful, genuinely happy. And something in Jennifer's rigid certainty had cracked. "I don't understand what you're doing here," Jennifer had said, standing in the clearing, looking at the double roof with obvious confusion. "But you seem good. Both of you seem—" She'd struggled for the word. "Whole, like you found something you were missing." Reid had understood then that forgiveness wasn't something that happened all at once. It was slow, like spring melting winter. But it could happen, given time and patience. Maya had chosen to stay, not as punishment, not as exile, but as choice. The custody arrangement had been modified. Summers with Jennifer in Boston, school years here in Montana. It wasn't perfect, but it honored what Maya needed: connection to both worlds, both parents, both versions of herself. Reid walked back inside where Sarah was finishing her lesson. The students, ranging from teenagers to young adults, listened with the intensity of people learning something vital. "The threshold is not your enemy," Sarah was saying. "It's not even really a place. It's a condition, a thinning of the boundaries between states of being. Your job as keepers is not to fight it, but to maintain healthy relationships with it, to help guide what gets lost, to keep the balance." After the students left, Reid made coffee for himself and Sarah. They sat in comfortable silence, watching through the window as Maya demonstrated something about the boundary stones to the graduate students. "She's good at this," Sarah said. "Natural teacher, natural keeper. The land chose well when it called her back." "We're staying," Reid said. "Officially. I've been offered a position with the new research institute, designing protective structures for other threshold sites. Maya's been asked to train other young people who have the site." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "This land is yours now. Was probably always yours, from the moment your daughter was born here. The threshold recognized her then, called you both back when the time was right." Reid thought about that. Destiny versus choice, fate versus free will. He'd spent so much of his life feeling powerless, controlled by circumstances and his own failures. But now he understood that even in moments that felt like defeat, seeds were being planted for future growth. Losing custody had brought him here. Building in isolation had prepared him for what was needed. Failing as a father had taught him how to succeed at it. "I'm glad she laughed at me," Reid said suddenly. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "My family. When they saw the double roof, they thought I'd lost my mind. But their mockery freed me from caring what they thought. Let me build what needed to be built without trying to justify it to people who wouldn't understand. Sometimes the wisdom of fools looks like foolishness to the wise," Sarah said with a slight smile. "And sometimes a broken man builds exactly what a broken world needs." That evening, after the students and visitors had gone, Reid and Maya sat together on the porch watching the sunset. The double roof cast long shadows across the clearing, but they were protective shadows, now comfortable. "Do you miss Boston?" Reid asked. Maya considered this. "I miss some things, my old room, certain friends. But I don't miss who I was there. That version of me was angry all the time because I was trying to be something I wasn't. And now? Now I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be. Threshold keeper, artist, daughter of both worlds." She leaned against his shoulder. Daughter of a man who built a shelter when his family laughed and turned out to be protecting something none of them could see. Reid put his arm around her, felt her solid warmth, her absolute realness. He'd built this place thinking he was building a retreat from failure, but he'd actually built a bridge between worlds, between states of being, between who he'd been and who he might become. Sometimes when life breaks you, you need to build something no one else understands. And sometimes, if you build it well enough and wait long enough, the people who matter most will find their way to you through that structure, will find their way home. The drifters still came at night, but they came peacefully now, knowing Maya would guide them when they were ready. The protection held, stronger for having been tested. And beneath the double roof, in the cabin built by a father's hands and blessed by a daughter's gift, a new kind of family had been forged. One built on understanding rather than obligation, on purpose rather than accident, on the recognition that sometimes the strangest architectures, the ones that make no practical sense, the ones people laugh at, the ones that seem impossible, are exactly what's needed to shelter what matters most. Love, connection, second chances, home.